Excellencies, dignitaries, ministers, officials, ladies and gentlemen. A very good morning to you. Let me introduce myself. I'm Juliet Foster, and I would like to welcome you to the second Riyadh International Humanitarian Forum. Thank you. If I could have your attention, please, thank you. I would be very grateful. Let me take you back in time. It's a very brief journey, in fact, to the first forum. It was held in 2018, and the many discussions that occurred revolved around changing humanitarian needs and attempting to formulate new, practical, efficient responses to the crises that were happening on the ground. Now, those who attended that conference spent many hours exploring the nature of humanitarian assistance, how resources could be used constructively, the scope for innovation, and the efficacy of localizing relief efforts. The event was a success, and the many ideas that emerged found their way into numerous aid and development strategies. That was then, 2018, not that long ago. What's happening today? Well, the humanitarian challenges are just as great, if not greater. According to the United Nations' own estimates, 1 in 45 people in the world will need assistance, including food, shelter, clean water, healthcare, and protection. The situation is likely to get worse until conflict and climate change, the key crisis drivers, are addressed. Globally, over 70 million people have fled their homes, either because of conflict, persecution, or climate emergencies, with many of them finding zero opportunities or indeed safety when they reach their destination. It is a worrying picture, yet there is hope. The fact that all of us are here today actually proves it. What drives humanitarian work is a desire to effect change, to do better by the people who need us the most, to deliver the opportunities that all of us take for granted, delivering those opportunities to those who have been denied them, either because they were born into conflict or born into extreme poverty. We're working to make the world a better, kinder, more responsible place that our children and indeed our grandchildren will be proud to inherit. By being here today in Riyadh, we are reaffirming our commitment to fulfilling those ambitions. In the time that we're going to spend together, we will find new ways to enhance and develop humanitarian action. And this forum provides an excellent space to vigorously and honestly debate how to improve practices. The expertise that is gathered in this room is phenomenal, and we must use it to look at how innovative approaches can be used to change the humanitarian and development landscape. The world's most vulnerable people need this change, and they need it now. Over the next 2 days, the second Riyadh International Forum will provide just that by encouraging strategic discussions to reach new, practical, and sustainable solutions. All of us are carrying an enormous responsibility. There is much to talk about and much to share. With your expertise, your commitment, your dedication to humanitarian action, we are in a unique position to improve how we serve those who need it the most. There is much to do, and we can get it done. So, I want to begin with the first of our high-level discussions, the importance of the humanitarian development nexus. So could you please welcome to the stage His Excellency Dr. Abdullah Arabiya, Advisor to the Royal Court and Supervisor General of King Salman Relief. Sir Mark Lowcock, United Nations Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Sir Mark. Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, Director General of the World Health Organization. His Excellency Dr. Bandar M. Hajjar, President of the Islamic Development Bank. David Beasley, World Food Programme Executive Director. and Christian Saunders, Acting Commissioner General of United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. And finally, can you also give a warm welcome to our moderator, Hadley Gamble, journalist and anchor at CNBC Abu Dhabi.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you once again for joining us, and thank you to KS Relief for inviting us to speak about some of the most pressing issues of our time, not the least of which what we've been seeing happen over the last couple of months across the world. So thank you all once again, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome this morning. We're talking about humanitarian development and collaboration. And within that context and that framework, I think it's important to take a few minutes to talk about the biggest story in the world, which is, of course, COVID-19, the coronavirus, its rapid spread, and what that really means for the people sitting in this room and around the world. And with that in mind, Director General, I want to ask you specifically about what we've seen over the last several days. We've seen the value of the global market tank by as much as 10%. We've seen over $3.6 trillion wiped off the US market alone in the last week. When you think about this, do you believe that this panic that we're seeing globally, that's affecting the global economy, is justified?
It was echo. I didn't listen what you said, and I wanted to use this.
Communication is key. When you think about what's happened over the last week.
Wait, which channel first? Can you speak now? That's only how it works. Can you speak?
Okay.
Which channel is number English?
Anyone have the answer to that question? Maybe one or two?
So I will try. Go ahead.
My question is, given what we've seen happening over the last several days with regards to the global economy, 10% knocked off the value of the global economy, 3.6 trillion knocked off the US market alone, is the market justified in the panic selling that we've been seeing?
Is the market justified?
Yes.
In the panic for corona. Thank you. First of all, I should say this virus is a new one, novel virus. So there are many unknowns. But through time, we're learning more and more. And we're trying to understand it. But if you see the current situation in China, where it started, the number of cases is now on the decline. And many provinces are not reporting corona cases. In the rest of the world, we get actually more cases being reported on a daily basis, more cases than China is reporting. So the last 3-4 days, that's what's happening. But at the same time, if you go into the details of the numbers, the current number of cases in the rest of the world outside China is around 6,000. And as you know, we have 6.2 billion population outside China. The number of cases is small. So one thing, as WHO have been saying, is because of the intervention that China was taking, the spread of the virus to the rest of the world was slow. That's why we have the number of cases in the rest of the world less. And we need to use this window of opportunity to contain the virus. It's not panic or fear that we need now. What we need now is, of course, we will have concerns. Of course, we will have worries. That's natural. But what we need is, without panic and fear, to focus, calm down, and focus and do the right things. Otherwise, panic and fear, not only the economy, can affect the economy, it may have political and social implications too. Even more dangerous things can come. So we need to see the reality and take appropriate actions based on the reality. Then I will go again into the numbers. Around 50 countries are affected now. Do you know that more than 50% of them have only reported one case? And do you know that more than 8 countries have not reported cases, those who have reported before, but have not reported cases in the last 2 weeks? And most of the countries who reported had reported less than 30 cases, majority. And also, do you know that the severity of although the virus spreads fast, but at the same time, the severity is actually less because we have more than 80% mild cases. So we need to go into the numbers, we need to go into the facts and do the right things instead of panicking. And countries, based on their situation, doing risk assessments, of course, should take actions proportional to the risk that they're assessing. And they may have economic and other implications. They should expect that. But panic and fear is actually the worst. It's actually more impactful than the virus itself. And that's why we have to be very careful. And then having said this, there is a recommendation from media and from some experts and some politicians to call this outbreak or epidemic a pandemic. As far as WHO is concerned, we don't believe that we have reached that pandemic level. There is a potential, and anything can go in any direction. There is a potential to be pandemic. But now, from the assessment we have, from the global assessment and national assessments we have, we don't see intensive and sustained community transmission in multiple countries. Meaning, the facts on the ground don't show that. But there are clusterings like in South Korea, in Iran, and also in Italy, that may go, these clusterings may go into community sustained intensive transmission, and maybe in other countries too. When this happens, then it may qualify to have the pandemic definition.
What is the threshold, just so that we're clear, if you could clarify that for us? What is the pandemic threshold? When we get to a certain point, then it is a pandemic.
So it's the transmission, the community transmission in multiple countries. And we're following that 24/7. So the advice we're giving to the world is what we should do now should be a comprehensive approach. We need to do containment to contain the virus. Even as we speak, there are countries who have already contained some of the cases they got. And in China, it's on the decline. So there is already evidence that it can be contained. So we shouldn't abandon the containment strategy because we see it's working in some countries. If you move into pandemic, you're saying containment will not be possible. So it's like a decision to live with the virus, and we will say, okay, let's do only mitigation, so we live with the virus. But that is going to be a mistake. We are not there yet. So the best approach we have is based on country-level risk assessments, global assessments, to do the containment while preparing for any eventualities for a potential pandemic. We do everything. So it's a comprehensive approach. Or Tony Fauci, my good friend, he's a US epidemiologist, incredible capacity, calls it blended approach. That's how we can get better, by investing in a comprehensive approach. And no panic, no fear. We need to focus. Of course, concerns and worries are there. There should be, but we should be calm down and work. And stigma also should be avoided, which we are seeing and which is dangerous. This virus is everybody's enemy. Everybody's enemy. And as human beings, we should stand in unison. Discriminating and stigma is the worst. It's more dangerous than the virus itself. Thank you.
In terms of that, the WHO has said that this should be a reality check for governments globally. Do you believe that global financial markets need a reality check, given what you've just said about fear and panic?
Yes, global markets, it's to everybody, by the way. They should calm down and try to see the reality, as you said, reality check, facts, figures, and decide based on that, rational. We need to continue to be rational. Irrationality doesn't help. We need to go back into the facts and the figures, and based on that we decide.
There have been a lot of reports, not just out of China, about what the Chinese government knew when they knew it, but also specifically about Iran. Do you believe you can trust the facts and figures coming from the Iranian government?
To say that, you need to assess. I cannot say, I cannot comment on this without having a proper assessment, having experts on the ground and so on.
Have you spoken to the Iranian government about putting experts on the ground?
Yes, we work with them. We sent teams, and the next team with logistics, medical supplies, and so on will be leaving on Monday. Thank you to the generous support from the United Arab Emirates. That's what I said, solidarity, and we're helping them. But there is, of course, one of the areas where we have clustering of cases, and we need to be acting aggressively and help them to act aggressively.
When we speak about that within the context of collaboration, does it worry you that you don't necessarily get straight answers?
Sorry?
When you think about this within the context of humanitarian collaboration, you need to know that the governments you're speaking to are giving you truthful answers in order to help them, in order to calm fears, not just in that country, but globally. Does that worry you?
We don't have this. Some of the speakers, I think we should, they should face this way. I can't hear you very well because it's echo. There is echo.
Okay. Is this a bit better?
No. It's the, must be the speakers. It's all of them are facing that way, I think. Can you repeat again?
Sure. Does it worry you that you cannot necessarily trust governments to be forthcoming about what's happening in their own country? When we think about this within the context of humanitarian collaboration, because you can't help them unless they're willing to tell you the truth.
Yeah. Of course, if somebody is not telling the truth, it worries. But at the same time, I wouldn't also frame any country without any reason or without having any fact towards that.
You're not worried about the fact that the Iranian government is giving separate figures than what we're seeing reported in media?
There are reports who come from the media, several. But this is, WHO, as you know, is a technical organization and should check the facts. We cannot just say what a journalist says. Even some colleagues told me, the journalist had done forensic something, so this is true, and so on. I'm not talking about Iran, but even on other issues. Then I said, if we follow a journalist's report, whether it's well done or not, then where do we end? It means we will be repeating a journalist report. So that's why we have our own mechanism. And from our own mechanism, we haven't seen that. But if we see, then of course we should address it, mitigate it.
You have your own people now on the ground in Iran.
Sorry?
You have your own people now on the ground in Iran.
Yes.
You do. Okay.
We are sending on Monday. There were a group who visited and returned, but we will have a bigger team on Monday.
When you look at this in terms of the response from various countries, U.S. President Donald Trump yesterday announced that they have 43 million masks and that the country is prepared for coronavirus. Do you believe that the response from the US government is the best response it could be?
You know, to fight this coronavirus, you need to have a whole government approach. And that's what US is doing by appointing Vice President Pence, so all sectors be involved. And you're following, I hope, the technical agencies like CDC also, briefing on regular basis and boosting their preparations. So if you do that too, that means, you know, the case identification, follow-up, everything that we do is in good hands. So from the political side and technical side, if you see from the two sides, they're doing everything that they can.
And specifically to Italy, given the construct of the European Union without borders, how worried are you about the spread of COVID-19 from Italy and beyond? Because we've seen it spreading rapidly.
Europe may have some surprises like Italy. You know, other developed countries in Europe may have surprises. But at the same time, what's good about Europe is they have strong institutions, so they can revamp quickly and address it. So that's what I believe. But I was saying last week, it's not just about Italy. There could be surprises in other European countries in the neighborhood too, and prepare well. But even for Italy, since they have strong institutions, I know they will manage it as quickly as possible.
Does that mean potentially shutting borders? Are we there yet?
There are many ways, by the way, there are many strategies that we use, and the country should assess its situation, understand the risk, assess the risk, and then take measures proportionate to the risk. It's up to the country.
Dr. Abdullah, I want to move to you and just give us your thoughts, if you would, putting this within a historical context, because this isn't the first pandemic that you've seen. Is the global community panicking, do you believe, at this point?
Thank you. Let me start by saying that I am not the health authority of Saudi Arabia, and there is a Minister of Health who's supposed to represent all of this. However, as a doctor and as an ex-Minister of Health, and having been exposed to two previous epidemics, H1N1 and MERS-CoV corona, I think what Dr. Tedros has mentioned is true, that we should be worried, but we should not be panicking. We should balance our reaction in a way that so far the indicators that this virus clearly has a stronger spreading power. However, it is still has a death or mortality rate which is in the 2% range, which is probably lower than other viruses such as SARS or MERS-CoV virus. I think the most important message to take away with us today is that the most important is how countries can control such a communicable disease, and strong surveillance is important to start with, to diagnose as many cases as you can, and strong preventive measures, including in some countries, highly selected travel measures. In China, we have seen the evidence of that being positive. I think those measures has proven to be correct for Saudi Arabia. So my advice to both the health authorities and the governments, that we should pay attention to public awareness, we should pay attention to public hygiene, more importantly, hand washing mechanisms, and in some cases, the use of selected masks, and this should not reflect adversely on the economy of the countries. Thank you.
Dr. Bandar, I want to pick up with you. When you think about this from a financial perspective, when you think about the global financial instruments that you would want to see put in place at a time of such, frankly, panic in the market, do you believe the market response is justified? Do you believe the market response is justified?
First, it is indeed a great pleasure and honor to participate in this important forum on how to find solutions to the most critical global humanitarian challenges. And I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Rafea'ah, Supervisor General of King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center, for inviting me to join you in this high-level session or event. In fact, as we see in the ground, that the global capital market are affected by these things. The economy of many countries, especially advanced countries and developing countries, are affected as well, because especially countries that depends heavily on tourism, and we hear in the news, for example, that some countries, that the number of tourists decreased by 30 or 40% of the total tourism, and also the number of flights. Some countries, they ban the movement from country to countries. In general, the economy as a whole, of course, are affected by this crisis.
Do you see this as a failure of globalization?
Do I see?
Do you see this as a failure of globalization when the engine of global growth, China, could so significantly impact markets?
Of course, the market, as I mentioned, is affected by all this instance, but I think certain measures must be taken in order to activate the market once again. Yes.
I want to direct this question to David. When you think about this within the context of what happens next, how difficult do you believe it is going to be to find the kind of collaboration that you're looking for at a time when something like COVID-19 could so significantly disrupt the U.S. economy as well as the global economy?
Repeat the question, please.
We're having communication failure today. So when you think about what happens next here, when we're trying to find this kind of humanitarian collaboration, something that's so intrinsic and so necessary for groups like yours to do their job, how concerning is it to you that we've seen such a total breakdown in the last couple of weeks as a result of COVID-19?
Well, I was sitting here thinking, you've had a few thousand deaths over the last few months on the coronavirus. We had 17,000 to 18,000 deaths yesterday from hunger. One person died yesterday in the United States from the coronavirus. 22 died yesterday in the United States from the regular virus. This is a serious issue, but I don't think we need to panic. What gives us great concern, and I mean great concern, and I was speaking to the European Parliament just a couple of weeks ago. We've got crises all over the world. You got Yemen, you got Syria, you got the Sahel, you got Sudan, and let me just keep going. Then you got the coronavirus, then you got the locust. There is a significant shortage of funds to address the significant issues that we're facing right now. And the last thing we need is for the world to panic and bring an economic recession or collapse when we already have lack of funding with a strong economy in some of the greatest economies in the world. And so we've been able to significantly increase our funding over the past couple of years by making the case, but we cannot forget, and this is what I was saying many times to leaders around the world, and especially to the media, because in the last 2 years, with all of the crises all over the world, the media was consumed with only two things: Trump, 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 or Brexit, 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 and now, of course, this Trump, 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 coronavirus, coronavirus. And we've got Sudan needing extraordinary help right now. We've got the Sahel in an absolute collapse if we don't go in with strategic programs now. Yemen is at a turning point. Syria is in a crisis. And the whole world is obsessed because the media is panicking, in my opinion, and not providing. And I'm saying this to many of my friends in the media, is that we need balanced coverage today. Because little girls and little boys, our little brothers, our little sisters, are dying from hunger, dying from coldness, dying from refugee and migration. And so we, working together, we're putting on the table solutions, for example, in the Sahel region, just in the Sahel region alone. And I made this comment on France 24, and I know Filippo was on France 24, I think, last week. And I said, if you think you had a problem with Syria a couple of years ago, with a nation of about 21, 22 million people, with a few million migrating your way, with a small infiltration by extremist groups, wait till the greater Sahel is destabilized, from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, 500 million people. And then you'll have migration by necessity of massive millions of people. And the French 24 reporter said, Mr. Bees, are you trying to scare the European people? And I said, I'm trying to wake you up to the reality. And here's the reality. People don't want to leave home. We assist about 90 million people on any given day. If I fed your home, in your neighborhood, in your village, every day for 2 years, do you think I would know what's going on in your community? So we do. People don't want to leave home. But if they don't have security and don't have food security, they will do whatever they need to do to protect, like I would, my little girls and my little boys. We've got programs, and this is one of the things that I think all of us have been, I want to say, harping to the leaders around the world, is that we cannot continue to piecemeal solutions. We do a little bit in Niger here, you do a little bit over in Mali over here, you do a little bit in Burkina Faso. We need comprehensive, scaled up approaches. We have solutions. For example, in Niger, and working with like Henrietta Fore and UNICEF and many others, we know when we come in with comprehensive programs, like, for example, a food for asset program, where we rehabilitate the land with beneficiaries. Our goal is to put the World Food Program out of business. Our goal is to have an exit strategy. Our goal is to create sustainability so that the citizens and people, whether it's Mali or Niger or Sudan, don't need us anymore. So when we come in with a food for asset program, rehabilitating the land, and complement that with a school meals program, let me tell you what happens. Migration by necessity drops off the chart. You can quantify what that means economically. Marriage rate by 12 and 13-year-olds drops off the chart. You can quantify that financially. Teen pregnancy.
But unfortunately, migration issues haven't knocked off 10% of global value. In the sense that, are you equating the migration issue to the importance of when global supply chains via China shut down completely and knocked 10% off the global markets? Do you see what I mean? Do you equate that, a migration issue, which is global, as you say, to how destructive COVID-19, coronavirus, has been in just a week and a half to the global market?
Well, the coronavirus, I mean, overreaction by the market is a problem. It clearly is a problem. People don't need to panic. People do need to take caution. In WFP and WHO, we work together strategically like on Ebola. We're the containment mechanism working with WHO. This is a completely different virus. the death rate is nominal compared to SARS or MERS, but it's still significantly above what is the traditional flu virus. And I do and have great concern that people are overreacting in the marketplace. I really, really do. And if they overreact continuously, and this thing gets dragged out economically continuously, it is going to have a catastrophic impact on the humanitarian development dollars that we need to stabilize regions of the world, and without such, extremist groups are going to exploit and create further destabilization. This is not a time to retreat. This is a time to step up, but it's also a time not to panic. It's a time that we need to act with reason and measure, but it must be comprehensive, and it must be with leaders of nations coming together with comprehensive, truly scaled up plans from region to region to region. And coronavirus is just one issue of the many that we're facing right now.
Dr. Abdullah, do you want to weigh in? Because the last time we saw each other, we were in Jordan at the Zaatari camp, and we were talking about donor fatigue and how significant that has played a role in what's happened in the last couple of years in that part of the world with Syrian refugees specifically. How worried are you that we're going to see a knock-on effect as a result of media and governments being obsessed with how to deal with COVID-19 on humanitarian relief elsewhere?
I just want to share what my friend and colleague David Beasley mentioned. We are actually panicking in the media over COVID-19, as you mentioned, and forgetting significant, actually, threats in the humanitarian arena and also in the public arena. I just want to emphasize the statistics. Motor vehicle accidents, hunger, cholera, malaria, many diseases kill more than what COVID-19 has done. If you look at how many people killed by cars in one day, that probably exceeds all the three viruses together, what have they killed in years. Now, going back to the economy, I just want to also emphasize that the significant loss in the economy is going, whether we like it or not, to affect the donor community. And it will affect also the target populations, namely the refugees, whether they are in Zaatari or Azraq or in Africa or elsewhere. I think it's a forum like this, we should really sit together and study how can we maximize the impact of our work together. It's time for us to rethink and use the valuable scientists that we have with us and researchers today, that how can we maximize the limited resources we have. And also, I want also to touch a word with the media, because in this forum, we have a session for the media. I wish to see that the media will pay attention to the humanitarian work. I think less is being published about the humanitarian work. I'm sure Mark will share with me that, and more so about killing and conflicts and others. It's time for us to revisit our priorities and put emphasis on how we select our priorities carefully, and also direct the limited resources to those priorities. In HIGRA conference, I think Juliet is here, she moderated the session that I was in. I have mentioned that now the UN is requesting 0.7% of the development resources from donor communities. What we are facing now is the donor communities decreasing, and many of the donor communities are not meeting the target 0.7%. Now, this has been, I think, for the last 20 years, 0.7. It's time for us to revisit this percentage at the UN level. It's time for us to review also our mandate in the UN to look whether it's time to increase it, and also put a mandate on many wealthy countries that do not participate in supporting the humanitarian needs of other countries in need that David Beasley has mentioned.
How much of a shortfall are you anticipating in terms of humanitarian relief as a result of COVID-19, given the fact that Gulf countries in particular probably won't be able to give as much with oil under $50 a barrel.
Again, I'm not speaking on the Gulf countries, I'm speaking about the global community. I think if we continue with this crisis, I'm worried that this may have a significant effect on the donor community. I don't have a percentage to say, but naturally, if there is a recession, it will affect donor communities. And I hope that a meeting that should be held in the UN level, maybe in the General Assembly, to study this further, and I'll leave it to Mark to address it and put an end to these issues concerning us in the humanitarian community and in the donor community.
Mark, do you want to walk us through that? Are we getting it right, at least so far, in terms of the response?
Well, what we've got at the moment in terms of responding to humanitarian crises around the world is record levels of financing. So people worry a lot about donor fatigue, but if you observe what is happening, that's not what you see. And my experience is, if people understand there's a real need and they believe if they provide money, it will help the people in that need, you can raise a lot of money. Last year, for the appeals that it's my job to coordinate, the UN's humanitarian response plans, we raised $17 billion. That is a lot more than we've ever raised before. And the UN has a market share of more than 70% of this activity. And with that $17 billion, we were able, as David was saying, to reach more than 100 million people, and unquestionably to save millions of lives and to prevent problems spreading further. Many of us on this panel have been doing this kind of work for a long time. I've been doing it for 35 years. And when I was first doing it, millions of people lost their lives in these crises every year. And now the loss of life is dramatically contained. The problem, though, is that while humanitarian assistance is extremely effective in saving lives, humanitarian assistance does not solve the underlying problem. Humanitarian need is driven firstly by conflict, secondly, increasingly by climate change, the wet events like the storms and the floods, and the dry events like the droughts, and thirdly, by disease spikes, measles, Ebola, and so on. And what the world needs to get better at doing is preventing and solving those kind of challenges. That's the way you get humanitarian need down. You get the world better as it used to be in resolving conflicts and preventing conflicts. You make faster progress on the SDGs. And when it comes to disease outbreaks, you do what Tedros has said. You contain and you prepare. And we do need to keep a sense of proportion here. As Tedros said, there are more than 6 billion people outside China, of whom 6,000 have been identified as having COVID-19. In other words, 1 person in a million. If we contain it and prepare, we can keep those numbers low. And that's the way to minimize what would be a very, very damaging redirection of effort away from those 100 million people whose lives we can save. If we redirect effort away from that, we'll find we've created a much bigger problem, because we, have been too driven by market overshooting.
Walk me through your thoughts then, given raising money in a difficult environment, and you've been quite successful in managing to do that over time, how worried you are about a shortfall, given what we've seen in terms of the panic of COVID-19. Because that is a real worry. If you've got global financial markets tanking, then governments are going to be much less willing to hand out.
Well, markets go up and down. I mean, I remember that the global financial markets had a little flutter in August 2014 when people thought Ebola was going to be a bigger problem than it turned out to be in West Africa. So I think what's needed is for people to look at the evidence and the numbers in the way that Tedros has talked about, and just retain a sense of proportion. If that happens, as I said earlier, and we double down on our commitment to achieve the SDGs, we can keep making the kind of progress we've seen in recent decades to improve the average life experience of every person on the planet. You know, for all the problems we've got right now, if you were a rational person and you had to choose a 50-year time span to live your life out of the whole of the 150,000 years of human existence, you would choose right now, because the average life experience of a person right now is much better than it's ever been in the whole of human history. And that's partly because development has been at a fantastic rate, and also because crises are better handled than they used to be.
Christian, I want to bring you in on that in terms of crisis being better handled than they used to be. And there is a lot of blame, no doubt, being cast on this panel on the media and an overhype of what's happening with COVID-19. But at the end of the day, the media is reporting the message that is given to them in many ways. And if no one is talking and no one is creating a narrative, then that can be filled with a lot of, unfortunately, misinformation, which could be confused as fact. When you take a step back and think about this within a broader context, how worrying do you find the response that we've seen from the global community in the last few weeks? Because we see a market that's involved in panic selling, per se, but at the end of the day, the engine of global growth stopped for 2 weeks as a result of what's happened. And you can't say that it didn't.
Well, I think communication is fundamental in anything, and I think it's certainly fundamental in getting the right messages out about COVID-19. And I think, frankly, the WHO has played an important role in this and has been sending out very clear messages on what to do, on how to respond. Many of the issues have been spoken about. Dr. Tedros talked about the need for containment and not to panic. But communication has in the past been a significant failing of ours in terms of the humanitarian response. It was a failure in Ebola, but I think we've learned from that. And it will be fundamental in order to tackle Corona.
Director General, when you think about this in terms of what your plans are going forward in terms of communication with the media, I know that there was in the past a lot of pressure put on WHO as a result of deciding to call something a panic back in 2009, a pandemic. That caused a lot of stress in financial markets. It's caused a lot of panic globally. Does that weigh on your decision process today in terms of at what point you call this a pandemic?
As you may know, we're doing daily press conferences, and our epidemiologists are also doing constant risk assessments. So we get our science-based risk assessments and announce it regularly. For instance, last Friday, we upgraded the risk level based on the findings. The global risk level now is very high. It was high until Friday. Now it's very high. So we will constantly check the disease situation or the epidemic situation. And when there is a need to act, to name it this or that, it can be done. And that's what we're doing. In addition to the daily press conferences direct from WHO, we now have special envoys representing all regions. And they're coming to Geneva actually next week, and we will have all the preparations we need, and this will also help in communication at regional levels and helping with at least countries from different regions from their proximity close by.
The CDC last week said that they were preparing for pandemic. When we talk about the collaboration between organizations, isn't it important that you are all on the same page? Because is the WHO preparing also for pandemic?
That's what we said even weeks ago. What we said is, based on the facts on the ground, containment is possible. However, the window of opportunity for containment is narrowing. So side by side, we need to prepare for a potential pandemic. That's what we called the comprehensive approach. That is the way forward, and that's where we are. But day by day, we see the window of opportunity closing or narrowing. And that's why we're asking countries to really be more aggressive in containment interventions. It pays off. Because, as I said earlier, some countries who had cases a few weeks ago have already contained it. And in China, we're seeing a significant decline. And the containment works. But at the same time, we cannot be sure. This thing may change direction and it may go for worse. So that's why we do containment, but we prepare for the worst or for the pandemics. And the best approach is comprehensive, not either or. We should avoid dichotomy or either or. We should have a comprehensive approach. And that's what we're saying, and that's the best way to go ahead. And this is based on facts and based on progress that we have already made, that we have seen in some countries already.
Mark, when you think about this from a UN perspective, what is the UN doing to coordinate that kind of coordinated response, essentially?
Well, for the United Nations, the World Health Organization is in the lead, and what the rest of us are trying to do, as the Secretary General talked and agreed with Tedros when he was in Geneva last week, the rest of us are trying to support WHO in fulfilling the global mandate they have to contain and prepare. Of course, we're a huge global system, so we have to do sensible things inside all our own organizations as well. We have to do what governments have to do, make sure everybody who works for us understands sensible precautions to take, understands what's happening in the international travel markets. So we're providing guidance and help with that as well. I have agreed with Dr. Tedros and with Henrietta Fore that it would be sensible for us to give them a little bit more money from the Central Emergency Response Fund so they can help the countries with the weakest health systems with their own preparations. So we're providing some resources for that. But the central point for everyone to understand is that for the United Nations, we're getting behind WHO because they are the organization with the mandate and the capability.
When you think about this more broadly in terms of happening on down the pike, we talked about how worrying it is that funding could be affected as a result of COVID-19 and the panic surrounding it. But when you think about just attention to your programs generally, we're talking about some of the most vulnerable areas in the world. Those problems aren't going to go away. They could even, in fact, be exacerbated potentially by COVID-19 and the spread of that virus. What is your deepest concern there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important question because what we've got is record levels of humanitarian need in multiple places. And, you know, there's a kind of bandwidth issue for global policymakers to be able to deal with everything all at once. So when I published the Global Humanitarian Overview, from which Juliet quoted the figures at the beginning of the session in December last year, and we said 1 person in 45 around the planet in about 40 countries would need help and assistance. That was our projection then. What's happened since then is, firstly, we've had this huge conflagration in Idlib, where 1 million people have been forced to run away from guns and bombs, and we've had to put out a supplementary appeal to deal with the needs of those people. We've got a huge, biggest locust outbreak the world has seen for decades across half a dozen countries in East Africa now, and now we've got other problems like COVID-19. So our basic approach is to do the best we can to describe the whole picture, and then from within the resources available to us, and I run something called the Central Emergency Response Fund, which used to be a fund of about $450 million a year, and last year it's about double the size. We're raising more money for that. We try to use that fund to compensate other decisions made which result in underfunding of some of the big crises. So, for example, I've just done a big allocation for that fund for the Sahel, which David was talking about, because absent those kind of decisions, there isn't enough attention being paid to the Sahel. We have sitting in the front row here the Minister for Social Development from Sudan. We provided $100 million actually from the SURF for Sudan so that the new civilian government, the government come to power as a result of the revolution, which the people of Sudan are very proud of, so they have a chance to be successful. So as well as dealing with the problems, we have to seize the opportunities, and what we're trying to do to support Sudan is in that category.
From an Islamic Development Bank perspective, I want to ask you specifically to speak to the financial instruments that would make your job easier, because I understand that various governments oftentimes stand in the way of that kind of humanitarian assistance for political reasons.
I believe that we are talking about humanitarian development, peace, and we in fact focusing on the symptoms. We are not tackling the root causes of the problems. Why we have the people migrate from their country to other countries. The root causes of these problems, when we look at developing countries, almost all developing countries, they are depending heavily on exporting raw materials. And raw materials, there are no value added or will not create jobs. In fact, it will export jobs to industrial countries. So the unemployment rate will increase, basically, and the people, they don't have hope, so immigrate from their country to another country. So here we have really to work together to create a win-win situation. Every year, in the 57 member countries in the Islamic Development Bank, between 10 to 12 million people entering the labor market looking for jobs. So if we don't build a resilient economy to absorb those people, just let us think of the consequences and the impact of such problems. When we look at the finance, our member countries, the 57 member countries, needs every year $1 trillion to finance the SDG, $700 million just to finance the basic infrastructure. When we look at all the MDBs, including the World Bank, African Development Bank, Asian Bank, the total financing is $150 billion. So we are talking about from billion to trillions. Here, how we are going to fix this gap or to bridge this gap. Here, this is the root causes of these problems. We really have to think about it in order to secure the people, not to. Other things also, when we look at the magnitude, the scale, and of the challenges facing the developing countries, we'll find it is a huge, immense. It is beyond the capacity of any individual institution or government to tackle it. So it is important to partner. The partnership here is very important. This is why the Islamic Development Bank, we created a whole complex, we call it Development Partnership, and we are transforming the bank from the Bank of Development to the Bank of Developers. Developers means to work with the government, the private sector, NGOs, civil societies, universities, research centers, and others. With regard to finance also, we have to come up with innovative, sustainable financial mechanisms such as blended finance, concessional finance, and other kind, how to blend grant with investment in order to find solution to all these problems. We need a huge of money, but we really to think of integrated, holistic solutions. We have to work together, humanitarian agencies with development banks and MDBs and other NGOs, civil society, in order to reach our shared vision that to create a world that no one left behind. This is what I think we have really to focus on rather than focusing on fragmented solution, or rather to focus on just financial assistance. Financial assistance is just one component of a whole package. We are really to focus on the package. This package has more components than finance.
David, I wanted you to weigh in on this one in terms of where we are today with finding that kind of holistic approach. When we talk about financial instruments, when we talk about collaboration between governments, obviously you've been doing this for quite a long time. Where do you see us in that trajectory today to achieving that kind of development?
One of the things that we've been very clear about in the last few years is you're not going to resolve the issues that we're talking about through the humanitarian funding mechanisms alone, number one. Number two is the old silos that were created back in the 60s and the 70s that were strictly humanitarian and they were strictly development. Well, those silos are now, we're trying to make the case they need to be torn down because there needs to be collaboration. Every humanitarian dollar generally should be a building block for a development opportunity. So we try to make certain that every humanitarian beneficiary is engaged in some type of community improvement project. Now, if it's a short-term emergency like a cyclone or something like that, that's a short-term different dynamic. But what we're facing today compared to years ago, now we have protracted crises that extend on and on and on. And you can't resolve those issues just with humanitarian dollars, nor just with development dollars. So the two funds are going to have to come together. And of course, we have to be cautious not to create debt, additional debt for countries that are already under the burden of debt. And this is a significant issue. In my opinion, the countries around the world that have the wealth are going to have to step up more now than ever. If they don't, they will pay a catastrophic price. For example, when the Syrian crisis, in terms of addressing root cause versus after the fact, for us to support a Syrian in Syria is about 50 cents per day. And that's almost double the normal cost because it's a war zone, so to speak. That same Syrian in Berlin or in Brussels, the total humanitarian package is 50 to 100 euros per day. Now, Syria is in a different dynamic right now, but the point is, in destabilized areas, if we can come in and address root cause with strategic comprehensive planning, it will save 100 to 1,000 times the money if we come in at the right approach. And I think the United Nations, the NGOs, we've got solutions to stabilize areas, but we need scaling up. And we need strategic planning, and we need for the media to help us get the word out that children are suffering and dying all over the world because of destabilization, extremism, climate change, and the list goes on. But I can assure you, based on what I see, and I don't think anyone on this panel would disagree, based upon all the crises that we're facing now, greatest humanitarian crisis since World War II, since the United Nations has been in existence, there is not enough money appropriated in the humanitarian budget and the development budget of the European nations and the Gulf states and in the United States to address all of these issues. And I do believe the leaders in the world are going to have to step up the game to so do. If we don't, it will cost substantial more money down the road.
And unfortunately, it seems as if a lot of this is at the whim of politics as well, and that changes, at least in the United States, from administration to administration. Director General, when you look at Iran specifically today, dealing with COVID-19 and other issues as a result of the economic sanctions put in place by the U.S. government, do you believe that what they call the maximum pressure campaign is actually hurting Iran's ability to fight this virus?
First of all, on what Mark said, I just would like to add, he had already said everything, but just a few. We have already triggered the UN crisis management team. As Mark said, we discussed with Secretary General, and then based on that, the UN-wide intervention is already in place, the crisis team. And delivering as one by the UN is bringing really good results. One example is Ebola. You remember when Ebola started, there were predictions, and Christos is laughing from there, our partner there in DRC fighting Ebola, the former commissioner of EU. On Ebola, the predictions at that time was, oh, it will be endemic, it will be all over the world, and there will be, I don't know, there were even a number of cases that were estimated, and all sorts of extreme predictions. But at that time, UN and others were focused, or especially the government of DRC too, containment will work, so we have to contain it in DRC, and then finish it. And that's exactly what's happening now. The last 11 days, 0 cases. For the first time, 11 straight days, no cases reported. I'm not saying there may not be another Ebola case after even tomorrow or after tomorrow. The place is volatile, security problems, so we may have 1 or whatever, 2 cases every now and then, but basically it's defeated now. And this is because of the coordination and the UN as one, delivering as one, as you rightly said. So on COVID, that's what we're doing, to work together as one. OCHA, WFP, UNICEF, you name it, and with our other partners. So I want to stress again for COVID, the most important thing is UN should deliver as one, should coordinate itself. At the same time, the global coordination should also work, and we have that too. Meaning, it's together that we can defeat this epidemic. When there is lack of unity of purpose, then that will, of course, be an advantage for the virus. And this is obvious, by the way. I don't need even to say it. So we need to fight it in unison because it's everybody's enemy. And I said it before, it's public enemy number 1 for now. And that's why it's everybody's enemy and we have to stand as one. On sanctions in emergency situations, it's not applied, so that's why we're working, and we will give all the support that Iran needs to the outbreak, and that's why I said the schedule was tomorrow actually, but there was a need, logistics need, preparations that delayed it. On Monday, we will have our team and necessary logistics on the ground.
But politics has no doubt hurt the Iranian economy, and one of the big questions is whether or not, as a result of the damage done to their economy, they are prepared in every sense to tackle a humanitarian challenge like this one.
Yeah, I think on COVID issues, it's better to focus on COVID, on the outbreak, and whether we're doing our best to address this epidemic. Focusing on it and then mobilizing the support Iran needs and giving support should be the first step and the most important one. Of course, there are things more than that you have said, but for now, people are dying. We have to focus on this and give this response in Iran all it can in order to contain it as soon as possible. So we have to be focused on this.
So you don't believe sanctions are hurting their ability to tackle this crisis?
What I'm saying is, in emergency situations, we can give them the support they need. So the best would be addressing the current issue and providing all supports that they need, and in the process for the sanctions not to affect it. So really laser focus on this. Sometimes when you bring it with other issues, you lose focus and you don't do what's at hand. So let's do what's at hand, and then the rest also can come. But let's really focus on this and make sure that there is nothing on our way to fight or respond to this outbreak effectively.
Mark, weigh in on this one because it's something that we discuss quite often. I was just speaking with the head of the International Red Cross, Peter Maher, 2 weeks ago at the Munich Security Conference, and he told me that the areas that he's most concerned about, given what we've seen so far at that point, the Sahel, obviously, the AFPAC border, places that are incredibly vulnerable. And I asked him that question as well. Does it bother you that you've got a country under economic sanctions like Iran that may not be able to tackle a humanitarian crisis as a result of those sanctions? What does the international community need to do here?
Well, it's very well established everywhere by everybody that when there's a humanitarian crisis, the world comes together and deals with the crisis. I don't think that's contested in any environment. In a way, for the topic of this panel, the issue is how we get better at preventing and resolving those things, and that's about the SDGs. Now, to the extent that countries' development efforts are constrained by the political environment or economic relations between countries, the smart thing to do is try to resolve those issues. Ultimately, that's in everybody's interest. In the meantime, it's a good thing for the world that we have a humanitarian system that's much more effective than it's ever been before, that is better funded than it's been before, and the world needs to be careful not to take its eye off that ball, because if those things change because we get distracted by something else, we'll find that the knock-on consequences are serious.
So COVID-19 is a distraction?
No, COVID-19 is a very serious problem that the world needs to take an intelligent response to dealing with. But it's not the only thing we have to deal with. We have to keep going with all the other problems as well.
Dr. Abdullah, before I open up the floor to questions, I wanted to get your take on how big of a challenge you see this for the rest of the year when we're talking about financial instruments that we need to put in place to help humanitarian efforts, when we talk about that kind of collaboration. COVID-19 obviously was a black swan event, or has been at least so far. How optimistic are you that we will, in a short amount of time, be able to get back to the focus of what we're here to talk about today, which is the implementation of the SDGs and humanitarian conflict management, as well as humanitarian development and collaboration?
As a doctor and as a surgeon, I have to be optimistic. And as also an ex-Minister of Health who lived through previous events similar to COVID-19, my hope and also expectation that COVID-19 will have the same dynamics as like the other viruses. My expectation with the upcoming summer and the warming climate, we will see a decline of the virus, and my expectation in April and May it will decline, and also the quotes panic in the media will slow down, and the humanitarian community will pay attention to their priorities. I just want to deliver a message that we should not be distracted from our priorities by events that are important for public concern, but we have to weigh them against the priorities for the humanitarian actors. And you mentioned an important point that we should not be distracted from the SDGs, which are important. And I think David mentioned a very important issue, which is the separation that has happened in the past between direct humanitarian relief and also development. I will put three things which are very important, which is the humanitarian, development, and peace. If we look at most of the root causes of the humanitarian crisis in the world, most of them are man-made, and I think it's a mandate on the international community to do what it takes to bring a solution to those money-driving humanitarian needs. And also we should play a very selected and careful role to remove the barriers between humanitarian and development and protect our SDGs and sustain peace in crisis, whether it is in Syria or Yemen or Somalia or others. We have also to increase the capacities of the host communities, which is usually forgotten, and it is an important player because unless we think of a community support and building the capacities, we will keep always delivering aid and not going to development. And OECD DAC has mentioned the crisis modifiers, which is we have to really implement it, which is having the flexibility to move the money from humanitarian to development and vice versa. Let me give you a quick example. In Saudi Arabia, we have initiated the Saudi program to rebuild and develop Yemen, which is very well interacted with KS Relief. And I don't know whether Ambassador Mohammed Al-Jaber is here, but we have a very strong coordination to ensure whatever we do in Yemen is complements our humanitarian response, and we appreciate their good efforts. Now, I want just to emphasize a few points before I conclude. We need to have an effective, efficient engagement. We have to have also better coordination. We have to have a flexible and appropriate financing and better programming, which is important. And we have to invest in evidence-based action, assessment and learning. I think we have researchers and scientists. We need your brains in innovation and creativity in humanitarian arena. We have to be effective on the ground, and we have to empower host communities, more so women in target communities. I don't want to leave here without thanking our players who are and partners who are working with us, who have made our work a reality. We hope this forum will reflect in a better resolutions that will bring prosperity to host communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I want to open up the floor to questions now because we have at least 20 minutes available.
Sorry, can I interrupt for one moment, please, Hadley? I do apologise, but unfortunately, time is running very tight, and I'm very conscious of the fact that Sir Mark Lowcock does have a meeting with the UAE Minister, and also as well, our guests have been very, very patient, and we are coming up to the time when they need refreshment. But what I would like to say to all of you, and to you, Hadley, is thank you so much for a very thoughtful and spirited discussion. Thank you so much. And before you go, I would also like to thank the WHO and Dr. Abdullah for really putting the coronavirus in context. We are here to discuss a wide range of humanitarian and development issues, and panic does not help. So thank you once again. Thank you. And Excellencies, dignitaries, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, as I stated before, we are going to temporarily break off from our proceedings for tea and coffee, which are being served outside. But can I ask you to please return here at 10 minutes to 11, 10:50. Please return here at 10:50. Absolutely essential, because at the top of the hour we will have the official opening of the second Riyadh International Humanitarian Forum. Thank you so much.